Picture a house, not a Templar, not a library, not a palace belonging to someone whose name history decided to remember. A house, the kind of house where ordinary people cooked meals and argued about money and lay awake at night listening to their children breathe. This house stood in Babylon sometime around the 6th century of the Common Era. The people who lived in it are gone. Their names are gone, but something they left behind survived. Under the floor, archaeologists found a bowl. It was made of clay, about the size of a dinner plate, fired and hardened and placed face down in the earth beneath the home. Around the inside of the bowl, someone had written in Aramaic, the language ordinary people actually spoke in that part of the world at that time. The writing did not go in a straight line. It spiraled, starting at the outer rim and turning inward, round and round, tightening toward the center like a trap being closed. On the bowl was a name. That bowl was not unique. Archaeologists have found hundreds like it across the ancient Near East, buried under the thresholds of homes, under the corners of rooms, under the places where people slept and gave birth and held their children in the dark. The writing on them follows a pattern, a formal declaration, using the structure of a legal document, ordering a specific presence to leave the household and never return. The language is not the language of prayer. It is the language of a court, a binding, a banishment written in ink on clay and sealed under the earth. People do not bury legal formulas under their floors merely because of stories in books. They do it because the story has crossed into something that keeps them awake at night. So before anything else, before Genesis, before Eden, before the long argument about who Adam married first and what she said when she left, there is this, a bowl in the ground, a name written in a spiral, and a family who believed that the only way to protect their home was to trap that name in clay and bury it where it could not move. Lilith was not born in Genesis. She was built in the long shadow Genesis left behind, out of silence, out of fear, and out of questions the text refused to answer. But to understand what was built, you have to start with what was missing. And what was missing begins in the very first pages of the Bible, in a gap so small most readers never notice it, and so deep that centuries of imagination fell into it and never fully came back out. Most people who have read Genesis think they know how it begins. God creates the world in 6 days, light and darkness, sky and sea, land and plants, sun and moon, fish and birds, animals, and then, on the 6th day, human beings. God rests on the 7th. That is the story. But read Genesis again, slowly this time, because there are 2 creation stories sitting right next to each other in the first 2 chapters. And they do not tell the same story about how human beings arrived in the world. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the text reads, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Male and female. Together, on the same day. No sequence. No one made first and one made second. Just 2 human beings created simultaneously. In the image of God. In one sentence." Then Genesis chapter 2 begins, and everything shifts. In this version, God forms a man from the dust of the ground and breathes life into him. God plants a garden. God places the man in the garden. Then God looks at the man and says something that stops the reader cold. It is not good for the man to be alone. So God creates animals and brings them to the man to be named. None of them are a suitable companion. Then God causes the man to sleep, takes a rib, closes the wound, and from that rib builds a woman. 2 chapters, 2 creation accounts. In one, man and woman are created at the same moment. In the other, woman is created from man, after man, as a response to man's loneliness. Scholars have studied this for a very long time and have reached different conclusions about why 2 separate accounts exist side by side like this. Some argue these were 2 distinct oral traditions woven together when the text was compiled. Others see a single author using 2 different angles on the same event. Whether you read the chapters as layered traditions, or complementary accounts, or a carefully edited final form, the gap between them mattered, because later readers noticed it and could not let it go. Some of those readers, particularly those attentive to the tension between the 2 accounts, eventually arrived at a question the text itself does not answer. If Genesis chapter 1 already has a woman, created alongside Adam, equal in the image of God, then who is she? Because the woman in chapter 2, the one made from Adam's rib, she has a name. She becomes Eve. Her story continues. We know what happens to her. The woman in chapter 1 has no name. The text creates her and moves on. She is there and then she is gone, swallowed by the narrative before it ever slows down long enough to tell us who she is. That absence was noticed. The Hebrew Bible is not a careless document. It was copied and studied and argued over with an intensity that very few texts in human history have ever received. Every word was considered. Every gap was felt. The people who spent their lives with this text knew the gap was there. For most of the early tradition, the answer was that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are telling the same story from different angles. And the woman in chapter 1 and the woman in chapter 2 are the same woman, Eve. The naming comes later. The detail comes later. But there is only one first woman, and her name is Eve. That reading held for a long time. But it did not hold for everyone, and the readers who could not make peace with it, the ones who sat with chapter 1 and chapter 2 long enough that the space between them stopped looking like a difference in storytelling style and started looking like evidence of something missing. Those readers began asking a question that the text itself never answers. What if they were 2 different women? What if the woman created in chapter 1, created simultaneously with Adam, in the image of God, equal in every material sense? What if she was someone the story had moved past without explaining? What if something happened between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 that the text chose not to record? Genesis does not raise this question. Genesis does not answer it. Genesis simply presents both accounts and moves forward into the story of the garden and the serpent and the fruit and everything that follows. But the question, once asked, does not go away. It finds its way into rabbinic commentary, into medieval folklore, into mystical traditions that tried to account for the full picture of creation as they understood it. And eventually, in a text written more than 1,000 years after Genesis was set down, it finds a name. That name is Lilith. But before she gets a name, Before she gets a story, before she gets a biography and a conflict and a reason to leave, she lives somewhere much darker and much older than Eden. She lives in a single word, in a verse most Bible readers have never slowed down for, in a landscape that is not a garden at all. She lives in the ruins. Open the book of Isaiah to chapter 34. You are not in Eden anymore. Isaiah 34 is one of the most violent passages in the Hebrew Bible. It is a vision of divine judgment falling on the nation of Edom, a neighbor and longtime enemy of Israel. God's anger comes down like a sword. The mountains dissolve in blood. The streams turn to pitch. The land burns and does not stop burning. What had been a country becomes something else entirely. A place so thoroughly destroyed that it crosses the line between ruin and curse. A landscape that exists after history has finished with it. And into that landscape, Isaiah sends a list. Owls will nest there. Ravens will make it their home. God will stretch out a measuring line of chaos over it and a plumb line of desolation. Thorns will cover its fortresses. It will be a haunt for jackals, a home for ostriches. Wildcats will meet with hyenas. Goat demons will call to each other. There the night creature will settle and find her resting place. That last creature, the one the text calls the night creature, is the word that changed everything. In Hebrew, the word is Lilith. It appears exactly once in the entire Hebrew Bible. One time, in this passage, in this context, surrounded by owls and jackals and the ruins of a civilization that God has finished with. That is the only place the Bible gives her. Not the Garden of Eden, not the beginning of creation. The end of a world. The question of what Lilith actually means has occupied translators and scholars for centuries, and the answers they have given are remarkably different from each other. The King James Bible, produced in 1611, translates the word as screech owl. The Revised Standard Version, published in 1952, goes with night hag. The New Revised Standard Version keeps the word as a proper name. Lilith. The Jewish Publication Society chooses Lilith as well, though with a note acknowledging the uncertainty. Some translations simply say night creature or night bird and leave the identity open. These are not just different preferences in word choice. Every translation of that single word reveals an interpretive decision whether the translators thought Lilith should be treated as an animal, a demon, a poetic night creature, or a proper name. When a translator chooses screech owl, they are saying this is an animal in a list of animals. When they choose Lilith, they are saying something is here that is more than an animal. The word itself does not resolve the question. It just sits there in the ruins and lets each generation decide what it sees. The Hebrew word Lilith has long evoked the night for readers across many centuries, and many scholars connect it with a broader ancient Near Eastern family of night and wind spirits. The Akkadian word Lilitu and the related figure Ardat Lili appear in Mesopotamian texts that predate the Hebrew Bible, associated with winds that carry disease, with women who die young and return as dangerous spirits, with forces that enter homes at night and threaten the people inside. Scholars disagree about how directly these Mesopotamian figures shaped the Hebrew Lilith. Some argue the connection is strong, and the word in Isaiah is deliberately evoking a figure the audience would already recognize. Others argue the linguistic connection is real, but the mythology did not necessarily travel with the word. That Isaiah's Lilith might simply be a poetic term for a night creature without any specific demonic identity attached. What both sides agree on is this: the word was not neutral. It carried the weight of night, of danger, of something that belongs to the dark spaces outside human community. Whether it names a specific demon or evokes a general category of threat, it does not belong in a safe place. It belongs exactly where Isaiah puts it, in the ruins of a destroyed civilization, in the company of creatures that make their home where human beings no longer can. Here is what that means for the story we are following. If you are looking for Lilith in the Bible, this is what you find. One word, in one verse, in a chapter about divine judgment on a foreign nation. She is not in the garden. She is not beside Adam. She is not refusing anything, or leaving anywhere, or arguing about equality. She is resting in the wreckage of Edom, in a landscape that has been stripped of everything that made it habitable, in the company of owls and goat demons, and the particular silence that follows total destruction. That is her address in the Bible, not paradise, the aftermath of a catastrophe. And, for a long time, that was all she was: a ward in the rounds, a shadow at the edge of a verse that most people read past without stopping, a creature whose name was uncertain and whose nature was debated and whose presence in the text was so minimal that she could have remained exactly what Isaiah seemed to intend her to be: one creature in a list, in a landscape of desolation, in a book that had other things on its mind. She could have stayed there, but the world that surrounded that single verse was not content to leave her in the ruins. Long before anyone wrote down a story about Lilith and Adam, long before the medieval texts that gave her a biography and a conflict and a reason for everything, there were people who already knew her name, not from Isaiah, from the dark. In the spring of 2007, a team of archaeologists working a site outside the ancient city of Nippur, in what is now Iraq, carefully lifted a clay bowl from the earth where it had been sitting for roughly 1400 years. The bowl was about 9 inches across. It had been placed face down, deliberately, in a shallow pit beneath what had once been the floor of a home. When the team turned it over, they found the inside surface covered in Aramaic text, written in a tight spiral that began at the rim and wound inward toward the center. At the center of the spiral, enclosed by the rings of text like something caught in a web, was a crude drawing of a female figure with her hands bound. Above the figure, in clear letters, was a name. The archaeologists had seen this before. Every researcher who works the ancient sites of Mesopotamia has seen this before. The bowl from Nippur was one of hundreds. Museums in London, New York, Jerusalem, and Baghdad hold entire collections of them. They have been found under the floors of homes, under thresholds, under the corners of rooms where people slept, under the spaces where women gave birth. They span several centuries, from roughly the 4th through the 8th century of the Common Era. They appear across communities that did not share a religion: Jewish households, Christian households, Mandaean households, communities with very different theologies and very different sacred texts, all using the same object, the same structure, the same practice of burial under the floor. That kind of shared practice across religious lines does not come from theology. It comes from fear. The text on these bowls follows a recognizable pattern. It is written as a legal document, specifically as a bill of divorce. The entity named on the bowl is formally divorced from the household. The divorce is declared binding. The entity is ordered to leave and never return. The angels are invoked as witnesses. The whole transaction is sealed in clay and buried under the earth with the face of the bowl pressed down, trapping whatever had been bound inside the text. People reached for the language of law because law was the most powerful tool their world had given them. A prayer asks for protection. A legal document commands it. The difference matters when you are genuinely afraid. And the people who made these bowls were genuinely afraid. Think about what daily life looked like in that world. A woman goes into labor and there is no hospital, no medication, no guarantee of anything. A child is born, and the first year of that child's life is the most dangerous year they will ever face. Infections that a modern doctor would treat in 3 days could kill a child in 3 hours. A fever that breaks today might come back tomorrow and not break at all. Parents in that world did not take a sleeping child for granted. They lay awake, listening, the way the family in that Babylonian house must have lain awake, aware of every sound, aware of every silence. When a child died in the night without explanation, the grief needed somewhere to go. Random death is the hardest kind of death to carry, because randomness offers nothing to hold on to. It does not explain itself. It does not connect the loss to anything a person did or did not do, which means there is nothing to fix, nothing to prevent next time, nothing to push back against. A death caused by a fever is terrible. A death caused by nothing is something close to unbearable. But a death caused by Lilith is something different. A death caused by Lilith has a shape. It has a name. It has a logic, however frightening, that connects the loss to something in the structure of the world rather than to pure chance. And if the death has a cause, then protection is possible. The bowl can be buried. The names can be written. The right words in the right order can put something between the family and whatever came for their child last time. These losses needed a container. Lilith was that container for families across centuries and across faiths. The Talmud, the great body of rabbinic discussion compiled over several centuries, mentions Lilith in a handful of places. And what is striking about those references is what they are not. They are not the story most people know today. There is no Adam in those passages, no Eden, no argument about equality, no flight from the garden. What appears in the Talmud is something raw and older, a figure with wings, associated with the night, with danger to men sleeping alone, with threats to newborns, with the specific vulnerabilities of human bodies at their most exposed moments. This Lilith does not have a biography. She has a function. She is the shape that fear takes when a child stops breathing in the night and no one can explain why. She does not need a backstory to be real. She only needs a name and a bowl to trap her in. Now look at what the amulet tradition added to this. Because the amulets reveal something the bowls do not. In Jewish communities throughout the medieval period, families developed a specific practice around childbirth. In the room where a woman was about to deliver, or in the room where a newborn would sleep, protective text was written on paper or parchment and hung on the wall. The text invoked 3 angels by name Senoi, San Senoi, and Semangalof, It commanded Lilith to stay away from the child. Sometimes it included a drawing of the three angels standing guard. Sometimes it showed Lilith bound. These three names, Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangaloth, appear on the bowls as well. They appear across communities, across centuries, with a consistency that suggests they were not invented separately in different places. They were part of a shared tradition, a shared story about why these specific three names had power over Lilith specifically. There is a story behind those three names, a story that explains where Lilith went after she left wherever she came from, what the angels said when they found her, and what she said back. That story does not come from the Bible. It comes from a text written more than 1,000 years after Genesis. A text so strange and so difficult to classify that scholars are still arguing about what it actually is. A text that might have been written as a joke. Sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, a text appeared in the Jewish literary world that nobody quite knew what to do with. It was called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. On the surface, it presented itself as a collection of wisdom sayings attributed to a sage named Ben Sira, arranged according to the letters of the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabets. Wisdom literature was a respected genre. Attributing wisdom to a revered ancient figure was completely standard practice. Nothing about the format was unusual, but the content was something else entirely. The Alphabet of Ben Sira contains stories that are, depending on how you read them, either deeply serious religious instruction or some of the most irreverent, sexually explicit, and deliberately provocative writing in medieval Jewish literature. It includes a story about Ben Sira as an infant who can already speak and argue. It includes tales that read more like crude comedy than scripture. It includes passages that scholars have described as misogynistic, as satirical, as folkloric, as subversive, and as genuinely theological, sometimes all in the same breath, about the same passage. No one has ever agreed on what this text is trying to do. Is it a serious transmission of ancient tradition? Is it a parody of wisdom literature, using the form of sacred text to say things that could not be said directly? Is it folklore that got written down and dressed up in religious clothing? Is it a deliberate provocation designed to challenge readers into thinking harder about the stories they had always taken for granted? Scholars have argued every one of these positions. The argument is not settled. It was not settled in the medieval period when the text circulated. It is not settled today, and somewhere inside this unclassifiable, argumentative, possibly satirical, possibly serious, deeply strange text is the story of Lilith as Adam's first wife. This is the moment the entire mythology crystallizes. Not in Genesis, not in Isaiah, not in the Talmud. Here, in a text that the scholarly tradition has never been able to confidently categorize. In a book that might be parody, might be folklore, might be theological provocation, and might be several of those things at once. The story the alphabet tells goes like this. When God created the first man, Adam, God also created a first woman, not from Adam's rib, from the same earth that Adam was made from. She was called Lilith, and from the very beginning, there was a problem. Adam and Lilith argued. The argument was not about theology or about fruit or about serpents. It was about position, about hierarchy, about who would be above and who would be below. Their conflict is framed through the language of physical intimacy. But underneath it is a dispute over something much larger: who has the right to occupy the higher place, and who is expected to accept the lower one. Lilith said the answer was neither of them. They had been made from the same material, at the same time, by the same God. There was no basis for the hierarchy Adam was trying to establish. She was not beneath him in the order of creation, so she would not be beneath him in anything else. Adam did not accept this. And so Lilith did something that no figure in any earlier Jewish text had done quite this way. She spoke the ineffable name of God, the sacred name that carried the full weight of divine power, and she used it to lift herself into the air. She flew up and away from the Garden of Eden. She went to the shore of the Red Sea. She was gone. Adam went to God with a complaint. He was alone. The woman God had made for him had left. God sent 3 angels after her: Senoi, San Senoi, and Semangelof, the same 3 names that families were writing on paper and hanging in birth rooms. The same 3 names spiraling around the inside of clay bowls, buried under the floors of homes across Mesopotamia. Those 3 names had a story before they became protective symbols. And this was it. The angels found Lilith at the Red Sea. They delivered God's message: return to Adam, or face consequences. If she did not come back, 100 of her children would die every day. Lilith refused. She told the angels she had been created with a specific nature, one that placed her in opposition to newborn children. That was her nature, she said, and she would not give it up to return to a situation she had already established was unjust. The angels threatened her again. She did not move. A compromise was reached. Lilith agreed that she would not harm any child protected by the names of the 3 angels. Wherever someone wrote those names, wherever the amulet was hung, wherever the protection was in place, she would leave that child alone. In exchange, she would remain where she was. She accepted those terms. She stayed at the Red Sea. Eve was created from Adam's rib to take her place. And the story of Genesis proceeded with the couple that history would remember. Now stop, because before you do anything with that story, before you decide what it means, or what it reveals, or what it says about any of the things it is tempting to immediately reach for, you have to sit with the problem of where the story came from. This narrative, the entire framework of Lilith as Adam's first wife, the argument about equality, the flight from Eden, the angels at the shore, the bargain about the amulets. None of it exists in any text before the Alphabet of Ben Sira. There is no earlier Jewish source that tells this story in this form. The incantation bowls invoke Lilith's name without this biography. The Talmudic references mention her without this context. Isaiah gives her one word in the ruins, but the complete story, the one that would go on to define Lilith for centuries and spread into Kabbalah and folklore and feminist theory and popular culture, that story makes its first known appearance here, in a text nobody knows how to read. Think about what that means. The most influential version of the story of the first woman in Eden, a story that has shaped how millions of people understand creation, equality, and the origins of conflict between men and women, traces back to a single source that scholars genuinely cannot agree was serious or satirical. A text that sits alongside crude comedy and talking infants. A text whose author is unknown. a text whose purpose is disputed, a text that was never accepted into any official canon, never given the authority of Scripture, never elevated to the status of the Torah or the prophets, or even the most respected rabbinic commentary. And yet, the story escaped the text and became something enormous. It traveled. It attached itself to the incantation bowl tradition and gave the bowls a backstory. It moved into Kabbalistic mysticism and became part of a cosmic framework. It spread through Jewish folklore across Europe and the Middle East. It became the explanation for why children needed amulets at birth, for why men should not sleep alone, for why certain protections were necessary against the dangers of the night. This is how myths survive. Not because they are authorized, not because they come from the right source or carry the right credentials. They survive because they are needed, because the questions they answer are real questions. And the people who carry them forward are not carrying them as literary curiosities, but as living explanations of living fears. The Alphabet of Ben Sira handed the world a Lilith who was fully formed, who had a reason for everything, whose conflict with Adam explained her behavior toward humanity, whose bargain with the angels explained the amulets, whose refusal to return explained why she was still out there, still dangerous, still the name written in spirals on bowls buried under the floors of homes where parents were trying to keep their children safe through the night. That Lilith, the one born in a text that might have been written with a raised eyebrow and a sharp sense of humor, became the Lilith that history carried forward. She carried with her a choice that the story records but never explains. She was offered the chance to go back. She said no. Go back to the Red Sea? Not the parting of the waters. Not Moses and the Israelites and the great escape from Egypt. Go to a different moment at that same body of water. In a story that happens before any of that. In a time when the world was still new, and the only two human beings who had ever existed had just had their first serious argument. Picture a woman standing alone at the edge of the water. She has just done something no creature in the history of creation had yet done. She spoke the name of God, the ineffable name, the name that carries within it the full weight of divine power, and she used it to lift herself out of Eden, not to worship, not to pray. She took the most sacred thing in the universe and she used it as an exit. Now she is at the Red Sea, and 3 angels are coming toward her. Their names are Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangalof. These are the names written on the amulets, the names on the bowls, the names that parents across centuries whispered over their children in the dark for hundreds of years. These 3 names were invoked as protection against exactly the figure who now stands facing the 3 who carry them. The angels deliver their message. God has sent them. Adam is alone. The situation in Eden is not acceptable. She needs to come back. Lilith listens. She says no. The angels tell her what it will cost. 100 of her children will die every single day. Every day. Without exception. For as long as she refuses, they are not offering a negotiation at this point. They are delivering a sentence. Come back, or this is what happens to the children you have already brought into the world. She says no again. Sit with that for a moment, because this is the part of the story that most retellings move past too quickly. A mother is being told that her children will die, 100 every day, as the price of her refusal, and she says no. This is the moment that every tradition which came after had to account for. This is the thing that made her irredeemably monstrous to the communities that needed her to be monstrous, and irreducibly compelling to every reader who ever looked at it from the other direction. She chose, with full knowledge of the cost. She chose, and her choice was not to go back. The story does not linger on what that cost felt like from inside. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is not interested in her interiority. It records her answer and moves on to the terms of the agreement. But the question of what is actually happening inside that moment is the question the story leaves open for every reader who slows down long enough to feel it. Read from one angle, she is the source of the danger. Read from another, she exposes something already present in the situation, a hierarchy she was asked to accept that had no basis in the facts of her creation. If she goes back to Eden, she returns to a situation she has already established, through an argument no one refuted on its merits, is unjust. She was created equal. The arrangement being imposed on her has no grounding in anything except Adam's insistence that it does. Going back means trading her own understanding of her own worth for the safety of her children. That is a real choice, a human choice, one that has existed in various forms across the entire history of people living inside structures of power that do not justify themselves. The tradition that told this story made one judgment about that choice. Other readers, in other centuries, would make a different one. The story holds both without resolving them, which may be part of why it has lasted as long as it has. After the refusal, the angels do something that the story does not quite prepare you for. They negotiate. They do not simply carry out the sentence. They do not return to God and report the failure. They work out a deal. Lilith tells them her nature, the harm she is capable of. The angels respond by establishing the terms under which that harm can be prevented. Any child protected by their names, by the amulets bearing their names, Senoi, Sansinoi, Smenglov, will be safe from her. She agrees to this. The agreement holds. This negotiated outcome is one of the strangest elements in the entire story, and it has not received nearly enough attention. Think about what it means. A figure who has defied God, who has refused to return to the place assigned to her, who has accepted the death of her own children rather than submit, is negotiating a binding agreement with 3 angels about the terms of her activity in the world. The negotiation implies she has standing, that her agreement means something, that the outcome of the conversation is a real contract with real terms that both sides will honor. This is not how the tradition usually handles demons. Demons are bound by force. They are exorcised, expelled, overpowered. They do not negotiate contracts with angels. They do not have their acknowledgement required before a protection can be considered valid. But the entire logic of the amulet tradition, the reason parents wrote those 3 specific names on paper and hung them in birth rooms for centuries, is that Lilith had agreed to honor the protection. Her agreement is what makes it work. She is monstrous, but she keeps her word. There is something deeply paradoxical about a figure who is simultaneously dangerous and a reliable party to an agreement. The tradition seems not to have examined that paradox too closely, because examining it closely leads back to the question of whether a being capable of honoring a covenant is really the kind of being that can be dismissed as simply evil. She stays at the Red Sea. She does not go back to Eden. Eve is created from Adam's rib. The garden continues. The story of Genesis proceeds with the couple that history will remember. Lilith is outside all of it. And here is the thing about being outside the story. Inside the story, you are subject to it. What happens to you is shaped by the logic the story is operating with. You can resist within the story, as Eve does, as Adam does, but the story still pulls you toward its ending. Outside the story, you are something else. You are the question the story could not contain. You are the figure who stood at the edge and did not come back in, and who therefore remains permanently. The thing the story has not accounted for. Lilith at the Red Sea is not defeated. She has not been conquered or converted or redeemed. She has simply chosen to remain outside. And that choice, which was meant to be her punishment, turns out to be something much harder to categorize than punishment. Because the story needs her to stay out there. The story needs the amulets to be necessary. The story needs the 3 names to mean something. The story needs the protection to be real. And all of that requires Lilith to remain present. Genuinely dangerous. Honoring the agreement she made at the shore. The story that exiled her cannot function without her continued existence in her exile. She was outside the story, but she was inside every home where a child was born. The angels went back. The protection was established. The terms were set. And Lilith remained where she had chosen to be, at the edge of the world, at the shore of the sea, outside the garden, and outside every story that followed it. Not gone, waiting, as the story moved forward without her, for the moment when the world outside the garden finally got large enough to come looking for her. In the winter of 1140, a rabbi named Eleazar of Worms sat down in his study in the Rhine Valley of Germany and wrote something that had been circulating in Jewish communities for generations, but had never quite been written down this carefully. He was compiling a guide to protective practice for Jewish households. It covered many things: how to recognize demonic activity, which prayers offered protection, what objects should be placed where, in a home where a woman was about to give birth. And at the center of his instructions about childbirth protection was Lilith, the amulets, the 3 angels, the names to write, the names to say. He wrote it all down with the precision of a man who believed that getting the details wrong had real consequences. He was not writing mythology. He was writing instructions. What Rabbi Eleazar recorded was not a story about a woman who argued with Adam and flew away. It was a practical guide for keeping a specific danger away from a specific room in a specific house. The theology behind it was largely assumed. What mattered was the practice. The correct names in the correct order, in the correct location. Because families in the Jewish communities along the Rhine had been losing children and they needed the protection to work. That gap between the story and the practice is where something important lives. Because here is the question that Rabbi Eleazar's instructions, and every set of instructions like them across hundreds of years, quietly refuses to ask, why did the story have to be this story? Why did the tradition reach for a woman who argued about equality and got exiled as its explanation for infant death and nighttime danger? Why not a demon with no backstory? No argument, no moment of refusal. Why construct a figure whose original sin was insisting she was equal, and then connect that figure to the deaths of children? The answer lives in what the story was doing underneath its surface. If Lilith left because she was treated unjustly, read from one angle, then the problem is not Lilith. for any tradition deeply invested in the stability of household order. That possibility was not something that could be left open. A woman who had a legitimate grievance and acted on it was a figure who could inspire others to see their own situations as grievances worth acting on. The story had to close that door, and the most effective way to close it was to make the consequences of her choice so catastrophic, so visible, so permanently attached to her name, that the choice itself became unthinkable. 100 children dying every day. That is what happens when a woman decides the arrangement made for her is unjust and leaves. The tradition did not invent this logic deliberately. Sitting around a table and deciding how to suppress female autonomy. That is not how traditions work. Traditions work by accumulation, by the slow layering of stories that feel true because they answer real questions and provide real functions. The story of Lilith accumulated around 3 genuine fears, and each fear added another layer to her monstrousness, until the original argument she made was buried so deep underneath the danger she represented that most people stopped looking for it. The first fear was about a woman outside male authority. In the world where these stories developed and circulated, the social order of the household depended on a clear structure. A wife was under her husband's authority. That was understood as divinely ordained, built into creation itself, confirmed by the story of Eve in Genesis chapter 2, made from Adam, named by Adam, given to Adam as his companion. The entire framework pointed in one direction. Lilith pointed in the opposite direction. She was created equal. Her Adam could not answer the argument. He could only insist. And when insistence was not enough, she left. A woman who leaves because the authority over her cannot justify itself is not a useful figure for a tradition that needs that authority to remain unquestioned. So she has to become something else. She has to become the proof that leaving was wrong, that the consequences of her departure were catastrophic, that the world without the hierarchy she refused is not a freer world, but a more dangerous one. The second fear was about sexuality outside sanctioned boundaries. In the traditions that developed after the alphabet, Lilith became associated with a specific kind of danger to men sleeping alone. She appeared in dreams. She was responsible for encounters in the night that produced children outside the structure of marriage. Demon children who populated the night world and caused harm to the living. This is an old anxiety, dressed in specific clothing. Every society organized around controlled reproduction and the sanctity of the marital bond has needed a figure that represents the desire which operates outside those controls. The encounter that happens in the dark, outside the household, outside the framework that keeps social order intact. Lilith became that figure, not because someone decided she should fill that role from scratch, but because she already existed as a figure of the night and the boundary and the outside, and the role needed filling. And she was there. The third fear was the oldest and most human of the 3. A child dies in the night, and no one knows why. The medical explanation will not exist for centuries. The grief is total. The randomness is intolerable. But a death caused by Lilith has a shape. It has a name. It has a logic, however frightening, that connects the loss to something in the structure of the world rather than to pure chance. And if the death has a cause, then protection is possible. The bowl can be buried. The names can be written. The right words, in the right order, can put something between the family and whatever came for their child. Rabbi Eliezer of Worms understood this. He was not providing comfort in the modern therapeutic sense. He was providing something more practical than comfort. He was giving families something to do with their fear. And in a world where fear of child death was not an occasional anxiety, but a daily reality, having something to do with it was not a small gift. What the Kabbalistic tradition added, in the centuries after the alphabet circulated, was a cosmic frame for what had previously been a household danger. In the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism compiled in 13th century Spain, Lilith became something larger than a demon who threatened individual families. She became a cosmic principle, the embodiment of the forces of severity and darkness that stand in opposition to the forces of mercy and light. She was no longer just dangerous to one child in one room. She was a feature of the structure of reality itself, the feminine force of the dark side of creation, present everywhere, that desire and danger and disorder gathered in the shadows. This elevation changed what containing her required. A demon can be exorcised. A demon is local, specific, addressable with the right tools and the right names. A cosmic principle cannot be exorcised. It can only be kept in its proper place by maintaining the right order, the right practices, the right relationships between men and women and God and the household, which meant that Lilith, in the Kabbalistic framework, was not a problem to be solved once and set aside. She was a permanent condition of existence that required permanent attention. She became terrifying not because of what she did, but because of what she represented, the possibility that the first act of genuine conflict in human history was not a man and a woman eating forbidden fruit. It was a woman deciding that the story written for her was not the story she was going to live. The tradition could not follow that possibility to its conclusion, so it buried it under everything it could pile on top. The demon children, the night visits, the deaths of infants, the cosmic darkness, layer after layer of monstrousness, each one added by a different community, in a different century, with a different, specific fear. All of them accumulating around the same original figure, the same original argument, the same original moment of a woman standing at the border of Eden, saying the arrangement is not acceptable. Underneath all of it, the argument is still there. Rabbi Eliezer finished his instructions and closed his book. Families across the Rhine Valley hung their amulets and buried their bowls and did what they could to protect the people they loved through the night. The stories continued to accumulate. The figure continued to grow, and the original argument, the one that started all of it, waited. In the autumn of 1863, a British painter named Dante Gabriel Rossetti exhibited a work he called Lady Lilith. The painting shows a woman seated at a mirror, combing her long red hair. She is not threatening in any conventional sense. She is not surrounded by ruins or darkness or the imagery of death. She is simply present, absorbed completely in herself, indifferent to whoever might be watching. Women in Victorian painting were almost always oriented towards someone else, toward a man, toward a child, toward duty, toward God. They existed in relation to other things. Their value was expressed through their connections, their service, their availability to the needs of the people around them. This woman is oriented toward her own reflection. She exists entirely for herself. And in the context of Victorian England, in a society with very specific ideas about what a woman was supposed to be and do and want, that quality of self-possession was not neutral. It was a statement. Rossetti knew the name he had given her. He knew the tradition behind the name. He was reaching for something in that tradition that the centuries of demonic imagery had buried but not destroyed. He was reaching for the refusal. The 19th century was a moment when questions about the nature of women and the structure of authority over them were beginning to be asked publicly in ways they had not been asked before. The first organized women's suffrage movements were forming in Britain and the United States. Women were entering universities, entering professions, writing books and pamphlets, arguing that the social arrangements they had inherited were not natural laws, but human choices that could be reconsidered. The Seneca Falls Convention had taken place 15 years before Rossetti put brush to canvas. The argument that women were made equal and deserved to be treated as such was no longer a private thought kept inside a private mind. It was becoming a public claim. Into that moment, the figure of Lilith arrived not as a warning, but as a mirror. She had been there at the beginning. She had made exactly the argument that women in the 19th century were making. She had said, "I was made from the same material. I am equal in the facts of my creation. The hierarchy you are imposing on me has no basis except your insistence that it does." And when that insistence was not enough to hold her, she left. The tradition had called that monstrous for 1,000 years. The 19th century was beginning to call it something else. The reinterpretation moved through the following decades and into the 20th century, gathering force as the conversations around women's rights, women's bodies, and women's authority over their own lives became louder and more insistent. Poets wrote about her. Novelists gave her voices they had not given her before. Scholars began examining the tradition with the kind of critical distance that made it possible to ask not just what the tradition said, but why the tradition needed to say it. And then came 1976. That year, a group of Jewish women in New York founded a magazine they called Lilith. The subtitle described it as an independent Jewish women's magazine. The choice of name was not accidental and not subtle. It was a deliberate reclamation. The women who founded Lilith magazine were living in the middle of the second wave of the American feminist movement, a decade that had seen the founding of Now, the passage of Title IX, Refute, Wade, and a sustained public argument about whether the social arrangements that defined women's lives in America were natural or constructed, permanent or changeable. They chose the name of the woman who had asked that question first. The founders of Lilith magazine were not staying in their assigned places. They were, in the most direct possible way, doing exactly what the original Lilith had done, refusing the terms that had been set for them and insisting on something else. The magazine became a platform for Jewish feminist voices at a moment when both Jewish institutions and mainstream feminist organizations were still figuring out whether women's religious experience deserved serious attention. It has been publishing continuously ever since. In the decades that followed, Lilith moved into popular culture with a breadth that none of the medieval storytellers who built her mythology could have anticipated. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, she had become a recurring figure in fantasy literature, horror fiction, television, and games. Each of these versions reached into the tradition and pulled out a different piece. Some took the danger and made it aesthetically compelling, presenting her as a figure of dark power whose monstrousness was part of her appeal. Some took the refusal and made it heroic, presenting her as a figure who was right to leave and whose punishment reveals something important about the structures that imposed it. Some took the ambiguity and stayed inside it, making her a character whose relationship to good and evil resisted easy judgment. None of these versions are the Lilith of the Alphabet of Ben Sira. None of them are the figure on the incantation bowls. None of them are the cosmic force of the Zohar. The honest answer is that all of them are Lilith. Not because the name can mean anything anyone wants it to mean, but because the figure has always functioned as the place each era sent the things it needed to say about women and power and authority and the cost of refusal that it could not say directly. The fears, the longings, the arguments that were too dangerous to make openly, they all took her shape. The ancient world feared what she represented and made her a demon to contain that fear. The medieval world built an elaborate mythology around her because the fear had not gone away and the demon was still useful. The 19th century looked at the demon and began to see something underneath it. The 20th century looked harder and found the argument she had made at the beginning still intact, still unanswered, still sitting in the text where the Alphabet of Ben Sira had placed it more than 1,000 years before. And the 21st century is still deciding what to do with it. Because here is what the whole arc of Lilith, across all those centuries, forces into the open. Whether anyone wanted it there or not, the argument she made in Eden was never actually answered. Adam could not refute it. The angels did not refute it. The tradition simply moved past it by making her monstrous and moving on. But making something monstrous is not the same as answering it. Burying an argument under centuries of accumulated fear is not the same as disproving it. The argument is still there, made from the same earth, equal in the image of God, refusing a hierarchy that could not justify itself on any basis except the insistence of the person it benefited. Every version of Lilith, in every century, in every medium, is circling around that argument, getting closer to it or further from it, depending on what the world around it needs in that particular moment, but never quite leaving it behind, because the argument was never answered. And unanswered arguments have a way of finding the shape they need and waiting. Go back to Genesis one more time, not to find something new, not to look for a hidden verse or a name that was removed by someone with a reason to remove it. Go back to read what is actually there, with everything you now know sitting alongside the text. Chapter 1, verse 27. Male and female he created them. Chapter 2, verse 22. And the rib that God had taken from the man he made into a woman and brought her to the man. The same two sentences that started all of this, the same gap between them, the same silence where a name might have been and was not. The question this story began with was whether Lilith was really Adam's first wife. It is a fair question. It is the question that has pulled people toward this story for centuries. The question in the search bar. The question asked by everyone who has heard the claim and wanted to know if it was true. Here is the honest answer. No, not in Genesis. Not in the Hebrew Bible. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife does not appear in the creation account. It does not appear in any text that carries the authority of Scripture in the traditional sense. It appears, for the first time, in anything like its complete form, in a medieval text of uncertain purpose, written more than 1,000 years after Genesis was set down. a text that scholars have never been able to confidently classify as serious theology or deliberate satire or something in between. That is the factual answer to the factual question. But the people who have carried this story forward across 14 centuries were not carrying it because they were confused about what was in Genesis. They knew Genesis. They read it carefully. They argued about it. They built an entire civilization of commentary around it. They were not fooled by a medieval text into thinking it was ancient scripture. They took the story of Lilith from the Alphabet of Ben Sira and did something with it because the story answered something that the scripture they already knew was not answering. And that is where the real question lives. Not whether Lilith was in Genesis, but why people needed her to be. Think about what had to be true for the Alphabet of Ben Sira to produce a story that spread the way it spread. Think about Rabbi Eliezer of Worms sitting in his study in the Rhine Valley, writing instructions for protecting newborns, building his guide around a figure whose biography came from a text that was possibly a joke. He was not naive. He was not careless. He was a careful and learned man, writing in a tradition that took its texts seriously. And he took this one seriously, or at least took the fear it named seriously. Because the fear was real, whether or not the source was authoritative. The families who buried the bowls under their floors were not asking about the literary classification of the Alphabet of Ben Sira. They were asking whether their child would be alive in the morning. That is the level at which this story has always operated. The silence in Genesis between chapter 1 and chapter 2 was not a mistake, but silence in a text does not stay silent. Every reader who brings a question to a text and finds the text has not answered, it will do one of two things. They will accept the silence, sit with it, let the unanswered question remain open, or they will fill it with commentary, with folklore, with imagination, with a story that gives the silence a shape. The tradition filled the silence with Lilith, and the shape she took tells you everything about the questions that were pressing against the silence from the other side. Questions about why human equality, if it was built into the image of God in Genesis chapter 1, did not appear to be the operating reality of the world anyone actually lived in. Questions about why women occupied the social positions they occupied, whether those positions were divinely ordained or humanly constructed. Questions about why children died in the night without explanation. Questions about where danger came from and whose face it wore. Questions about what happened to the people who could not find themselves in the narrative, who looked at the text and found a gap where they expected to find themselves. Lilith was the answer to all of those questions at once. She explained the gap in Genesis by filling it with a person. She explained infant mortality by giving it a cause. She explained the social position of women by grounding it in a story about a primal conflict rather than an arbitrary human arrangement. She explained the danger of the night by giving it a name and a face and a history and, crucially, a set of countermeasures that gave frightened parents something to do. She did an enormous amount of work for a figure whose only direct appearance in the Bible is a single uncertain word in a verse about ruins. But the work she was doing was not just the work of explanation. It was the work of containment. The tradition that made her monstrous was managing something much more volatile than infant mortality or nighttime fear. It was managing the equality question, the one she raised at the beginning, the one that the angels at the shore did not answer, the one that Genesis did not answer before them. If she was right, if the hierarchy imposed on her in Eden had no basis in the facts of creation, then every hierarchy built on the same logic had the same problem. And that was not a conclusion the tradition could reach without dismantling the social order it was also trying to maintain. So the story did what stories do when they contain something they cannot accommodate. It made the person who raised the uncomfortable question into the monster. It located the danger in her rather than in the situation she was responding to. It gave her a punishment visible enough and severe enough that the question she raised would be permanently associated with catastrophic consequences. 100 children dying every day. The story worked. For centuries. It worked. The figure of Lilith remained outside the garden. Outside redemption. Outside every story that ended with something other than loss. The hierarchy she had refused remained in place. Grounded now, not just in the creation account of Genesis chapter 2, but in the cautionary weight of what happened to the woman who disputed it. But the story could only work as long as the question she raised was not the question the era was asking. The moment the question became the era's question, the woman in Rossetti's painting appeared. The magazine in New York was founded. The argument that had been buried under 14 centuries of monstrousness was dug back up, dusted off, and found to be exactly as intact as it had been on the day it was first made. Because burying an argument is not the same as answering it. This is what the full arc of Lilith reveals. Followed from the incantation bowls to the feminist magazines, to wherever the story is traveling right now. It is not a story about a demon. It is a story about a question. A question asked at the beginning, answered with a punishment, buried under a mythology of fear and danger. And then, when the world was finally ready to hear it again, found exactly where it had been left, still intact, still unanswered. Picture that house in Babylon one more time. The ordinary house. The family inside it. The child breathing in the dark while the parents lay awake listening. Someone in that house, at some point in the long night, got up and made a bowl, took clay and fired it, and wrote in careful spiraling letters the name of the thing they were afraid of, and pressed it face down into the earth under the floor where they slept, and believed, with whatever faith they had, that the name written in the right words, in the right order, would keep the danger at bay until morning. They were not wrong to be afraid. They were not wrong to need something to do with the fear. What they could not have known, pressing that bowl into the earth in a house in Babylon in the 6th century, was that the name they were trapping had started as a question, not a demon. That the danger they were trying to contain had begun as an argument about equality that no one had been able to answer. That the protective system they were trusting with their child's life was built on the agreement of a woman who had been offered the chance to come back and had said no. Who had been told what it would cost her and had said no anyway. Who had chosen to remain at the shore of the Red Sea with the terms she had negotiated rather than return to the situation she had left. She was outside the story, but she was inside every home where someone was afraid. Was Lilith really Adam's first wife? She was not in Genesis, but she was born from it. From every question it raised and declined to answer. From every reader who looked at the space between chapter 1 and chapter 2 and felt something was missing. The silence in Genesis did not create Lilith directly, but it left a space large enough that she could live inside it. And the fears and questions and needs of 100 generations filled that space with her shape, with her argument, with her refusal, with her name. She has been living there ever since. The bowl is under the floor. The name is written in a spiral. The silence in Genesis is exactly where it has always been. And somewhere at the edge of the story, at the shore of a sea, outside the garden and outside every narrative that tried to contain her, the question she carried is still open. It has been waiting a very long time for an honest answer.